So today we're going to be talking about scientific method and research methodology in psychology, specifically psychological science. So we're going to talk about sort of what is science, talk about empiricism, and a few other things. So let's start off with what is science. We all have this sort of view about science involving these sort of sciencey things, and test tubes and all sorts of technology, but at its very core, science is an epistemology. That is, it's a way of knowing or gaining knowledge. It's a way of searching for truth, and it's one of many ways to obtain knowledge. We obtain knowledge by experience, by inference, that is rationalism. We try to acquire knowledge through intuition, and we acquire it from others. And today we're going to focus on science as a way of knowing, or a method by which we can gain information or knowledge or truth. So in this fairly brief talk, we're going to talk about empiricism, that is how to know stuff. Talk a little bit about the art of empiricism, things like operational definitions and validity and reliability, different kinds of measures. And then we're going to finish up with some pretty specific psychological science discussions on what we call demand characteristics and observer bias. So let's start with empiricism. And empiricism is simply the belief that accurate knowledge can be obtained through observation. That is, we can learn about the world by looking at it very closely. So for example, you learn by seeing, by observing, or experiencing things. So essentially, you can think about empiricism as a way in which we've explored our world since we were born. We learn how things work. We learn not to touch things that are hot through direct experience. To contrast that with what we call authority or authoritarian epistemology, that's when somebody tells you something is hot and not to touch it. You learn a lot more when you touch something hot and then learn not to do it again. So learning through direct experience is what we call empiricism. The scientific method is simply a set of principles about the appropriate relationship between ideas and evidence. So this is how we go about systematically collecting evidence to demonstrate knowledge about our world. So we systematically investigate phenomena through the scientific method. It's based in principle on theories. So theories are hypothetical explanations of natural phenomena. That is, we try to come up with systematic explanations for how things work, why they work, and then we use those to make predictions about future research. So theory is always used to guide our research, to make predictions, and then we take that evidence that we go out and gather through empiricism and bring it back and revise our theories. One of the things we always try to do with a theory is follow what's called the principle of parsimony. It's also known as Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is fairly simple. That is, we prefer simpler explanations, and we call those more parsimonious explanations. So the reason we prefer simple explanations is they are simply logically more likely to be correct. That is, a more complex explanation has more things that can potentially go wrong with it. So if you think about just the simplest explanation, we have one theory that has 10 suppositions or 10 things that have to be right, and a second theory that has 5 things that are suppositions or assumptions that have to be assumed to be true or be right. So 10 versus 5. And by sheer random chance, we're going to pick one thing to be wrong. Which one is automatically necessarily more likely to be wrong? Well, the theory with 10 assumptions is twice as likely to be wrong as the one with 5, just by sheer mathematics. So that's what's behind the principle of parsimony. It's pretty much that simple. It's a rationalist idea for scientific theory. Now, when we talk about scientific theory and hypotheses, we want detailed predictions. That is, we want to be able to precisely predict phenomenon with our theory. But we don't want it to be complicated as to why that thing is correct. So it's kind of sometimes feels like these things are in opposition. So we want to be able to predict things with as much detail as possible, but we want the explanation, the reasons behind it to be as simple as possible. So based on theory, we can demonstrate or develop, hypotheses. And these are falsifiable predictions that are produced by a theory. So for example, you might have some theory about, let's do something simple, alcohol impairing driving performance. Okay? Which we know that's true, but let's just take something simple. That theory is that alcohol will impair driving performance. Well, based on that, we can generate sets of specific hypotheses to test. So we might test, does alcohol, the effect of alcohol on balance and orienting. So we state a specific hypothesis that, with increasing alcohol intoxication, ability to balance will be limited or will be inhibited or worse. And then we develop a set of very specific predictions. So things like participants will be able to stand on one leg for less period of time or less able to do so the more they drink, something like that. So those are specific testable predictions. So all in all, we develop this into an overall research study. So for example, people who are intoxicated will show less motor coordination. That's our hypothesis that we're going to formulate based on our theory. We're going to design a study, so we plan an experiment in which we give alcohol to one group and no alcohol to a control group. Or alternatively, we compare people before and after drinking alcohol. We give people alcohol and measure motor coordination and balance, maybe one-legged standing, standing on a balance board, something specific like that. So we select tasks that are appropriate to collect this information. Then we analyze the data. We use statistical techniques to assess whether the results are genuine or possibly due to chance. And then we disseminate those results. We report those findings in a peer-reviewed journal, at a conference, or in a book in some way. And so we're able to actually constantly collect data and promote and revise theories through this research process. So the way we go about doing these research studies is what we call the empirical method. So this is basically a set of rules and techniques for systematic observation. People are difficult to study because they're complex, variable, and we tend to be reactive. That is, you can't just go up and watch people without them noticing that you're watching them. So we have to be fairly sophisticated in our research methodology. This is one of the reasons why developing good psychological research studies is oftentimes more difficult than developing a good biology or chemistry project, because people are far more complex in general than any other kind of organism. We tend to be more reactive, we tend to not like to be observed, we tend to change the way we act when we're being observed, we tend to do things like answer ways in which we think you want us to answer. So we're very complicated. So we use these methods of observation and methods of explanation to try to do this in a systematic way. So one of the first things we have to do is to figure out how to measure things. So we have to define a property we wish to measure and then find a way to detect it. And again, this is easy in physical sciences. How much does it weigh? How fast does it move? What color is it? What, etc. So for psychology studies, we have to come up with what we call operational definitions. So these are descriptions of properties in concrete, measurable terms. And so, for example, I'll give you a simple example that I like to use. I have this belief that your ability to parallel park is inversely proportional to the number of people who are watching you parallel park. So that is, the more bystanders there are, the more difficulty you will have parallel parking. So you can actually develop this into a set of operational definitions to try to figure out how to test that hypothesis. So we can do things like we can go out and observe people parallel parking where there's people nearby or not, and then we can come up with operational definitions for ability to parallel park. So it might be things like how long does it take them to get into their parking spot, how many attempts does it take, how much damage did they cause to nearby vehicles, how many injuries do they cause. Obviously, those are kind of ridiculous examples, but these are the kinds of things that as psychologists we have to develop into specific definitions. So when we measure psychological properties, we have to come up with devices or instruments to detect a condition to which an operational definition refers. And sometimes this is just out watching, sometimes this is a survey instrument, sometimes this is something like trying to detect whether or not somebody's lying. So we'd use electromyography, which examines muscle tension, or we might do things like galvanic skin response to see if someone is sweating more. So one of the questions we have to determine when we're trying to figure out how to measure a psychological property is whether or not we have selected a valid measure. So this is the extent to which a measurement and a property are conceptually related. So for example, we were just talking about lie detector tests. So lie detector tests are very good at measuring heart rate. They're very good at measuring blood pressure. They're very good at measuring respiration and galvanic skin response. And all of those physiological measures, they're perfectly valid for those. But they're not valid at all for determining whether or not somebody's lying. And so this is a really important thing to determine, is whether or not we are using a valid measure. Is it measuring what it's supposed to? Reliability is another important property of psychological tests. So the tendency for a measure to produce the same measurement whenever it is used to measure the same thing. So, for example, if we were to give participants the Beck Depression Inventory today and then give it again tomorrow, there shouldn't be, barring some unforeseen circumstances, there shouldn't be that much difference in the two. That is, they should have a consistent measurement. This is one of the major criticisms of a lot of personality tests, and you see these a lot, and used a lot and misused a lot. And one of the challenges of those is because they are often not reliable. And so that's something to watch out for, and something we talk about in a lot of contexts. So to give you an idea about the relationship between validity and reliability, if a measure is consistently producing similar results but is not measuring what it's supposed to, that it's not on target, we would consider it reliable but not valid. That is, it's consistently bringing back the right measure, but a similar measure, but it's not the right measure. So you could think about something like a bathroom scale. If it's off by 5 pounds, it'll consistently give you similar weights, but it's not giving you an accurate weight. So it's telling you a weight, but not an accurate one. So then in our second target, we have both reliable and valid measures. And then finally, we have an unreliable and hence not valid. Any measure that is not reliable is automatically not valid because it's constantly giving you a lot of error. That is, it's not bringing back the same response, and as a result, you are ending up with measurements that are all over the place. And so if they're not reliably bringing back the same similar result, it's automatically not valid. So one other property I wanted to talk about is what we call power. And this has to do with the ability of a measure to detect concrete conditions specified in our operational definition. So this comes up a lot, particularly in psychological measurement, is whether or not a measure is sensitive enough and whether or not it has enough power to detect conditions that are in our operational definitions. So to give you an example, there is what's called the mini mental status exam. And the mini mental status exam is really good as a quick measure of whether or not someone has a significant neurological injury. It is not good for measuring small changes in cognitive functioning. It's a global measurement scale. But it's often been used in research studies to determine whether or not, say, hormone supplementation benefits cognition. It's not a good cognitive measure. It's a good measure of whether or not somebody's head is still attached to their body or whether or not they've had significant head injury, but it's not sensitive enough, that is, it doesn't have enough power to detect smaller differences in functioning. And so it's useful from a clinical perspective, but completely useless from a research perspective because of that. So the final things I want to talk about in this particular series is some specific examples of how systematic empiricism can go awry in psychological science. So the first of these are what we call demand characteristics. These are aspects of an observational setting that cause us to behave as people think they should. That is, people change their observation based on what they think is being demanded of them. So we'll first talk about the case of clever Hans, pictured here. And the belief was by Hans's trainer and others is that Hans was able to do math, and he was able to do all sorts of crazy things. So they would ask him to give him these math problems, and then he would paw out the result. And it turns out if you blocked Hans from seeing the people around him, he couldn't do math anymore. That is, if there wasn't somebody there for him to respond to, he wasn't able to do math. What clever Hans was doing was he was carefully observing those around him, and as he was getting to the answer, he knew when to stop. And so he was able to do math because the people around him were able to do math. So Hans was a clever observer, but he was responding to those around him. This is a classic example of a demand characteristic. That is, we are highly sensitive to those around us. And the problem with demand characteristics is we can, as experimenters, can be giving off subtle cues about how participants are to respond. Another classic example is in the social psychology literature. There's a classic finding where if students were primed with words related to old age, feeble, infirm, that sort of thing, they left the experiment walking more slowly than they did if they got primed with other words. The problem is, in that initial study, the experimenters were not blind to condition. That is, they knew which condition the subjects were in, so they were possibly giving off subtle cues. They were also using just a stopwatch to measure how quickly they walked away. And it turns out if you took away all of those variables and simply measured electronically using either a laser or some other kind of device to see how quickly they passed between a couple of points, they weren't walking any faster, and there wasn't anyone there to sort of encourage them in subtle and unconscious ways. So as psychological scientists, we have to be very careful of this. And so one of the things that the computer age has done for us is it allows us to completely remove as much of this as possible by having people, by taking sort of the ability of people to encourage their responses away. To give you another example, when I was in, I want to say high school, middle school, somewhere in there, I was undergoing color vision testing. I'm on what's called an anomalous trichromat. And there is a vision test called the FM100 where you arrange these little color chips in order. And I had arranged them, and the person giving the test was like, "Are you sure about this one?" and pointed to them. And essentially, they were telling me that that was wrong, so I changed them, of course. It's an example of a bad test environment. So you have to be very careful with these kind of psychological tests. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to do naturalistic observations if we can. This is a technique for gathering scientific information by unobtrusively observing people in their natural environments. This is very difficult to do because you can't just stand around and take notes. People notice that. They notice cameras. It's obviously also unethical to record people if they don't know they're being recorded. So this is a technique that's often used for animal research, and then even things sometimes like consumer research. There's lots of naturalistic observation there. So whenever you walk into a store, you're really tracked the entire time you're there, particularly if you're at a department store. They see where you go, how long you spend in any specific area, and all of that's to try to get you to spend more money. One of the things we have to watch out for is observer bias. This is again related to demand characteristics. These are just simply that our expectations can influence our observations and our perceptions of reality. So if we are doing something like naturalistic observation, any bias we might have can color that observation about what we see and what we observe and what we record. And so that's something to be cautious of. It's also important to understand that these things oftentimes don't occur at a conscious level. And so you have to be very careful when you design studies to eliminate the possibility for observer bias and demand characteristics to the greatest extent possible. So one of the things we often do is we use what's called a double-blind procedure. So an observation whose true purpose is hidden both from the observer and the person being observed. So in an experiment, we do this all the time. Drug studies, this is the gold standard, where the person conducting the research study doesn't know if the person got a drug or a placebo, and the person receiving the drug doesn't know if they got drug or placebo, and that's to make sure that there is no bias at all. So this is just a simple procedure we can use to try to eliminate both these demand characteristics and observer bias. So that's a very brief introduction to the scientific methodology we use in psychological science. In future postings, I'll be talking about psychological data and specifically about experimental psychology.